certainly a pleasure to be here, and Cynthia and Brian gave me a title for my presentation when I wasn't here, so that gave me a little bit of latitude to talk, and I want to talk about nutrient cycles and pastures today. I'll move this down just a little bit. Can you all still hear me okay in the back? All right. And I want to talk a little bit about nutrient cycles and pastures, but I want to do it kind of from a unique angle. I think I'm going to turn this light off here so we can see the slides a little bit better. Is that too much? Do you guys have enough light? I don't want anybody to fall asleep. Brian Campbell made the coffee this morning, and it's actually pretty good. And he's not a coffee drinker. But I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the soil and how what's happening in the soil aids in building strong nutrient cycles and pastures. And this is going to be a little bit different than some of the other talks you have. And one of my objectives today is to kind of make you a little bit more aware of all the things that are going on in the soil. And before I even start, I want to acknowledge that I got a lot of these slides and from Ellen Arnaudin, which was my graduate student, and from Ed Rayburn, who's a colleague at West Virginia University, and both of those are exceptional individuals, and I give them full credit for this presentation. And I kind of took some of their slides and made some of mine and kind of melded everything together into what I thought was a coherent talk for today. The first thing I always like to talk about is a little bit about sustainable forage livestock systems. And everybody throws that term sustainable around, and I think it's important to kind of talk a little bit about what you mean. And we're really in a business of harvesting solar energy, so sunlight, and converting that sunlight into a high-quality product that people can eat. That, or wear, if you're in the fiber production situation. But that's really important, and that's really the objective of a livestock producer, is to take that solar energy from the sun and somehow get it into a product that people can eat. And the nice part about our systems is that we can use land that's maybe not the best suited for crop production. So marginal land in the United States, which could be used in crop production in some cases, but may have restrictions in terms of erosion or sedimentation. Marginal land that can't be used for crop production, and land that's too hilly, shallow soils that are lower in fertility, we can use for livestock production, and that's important to get the most out, especially with the population expanding at the rate it is. Very important part of a sustainable forage livestock system is that we not only protect our natural resources. I don't think that's good enough anymore. I think we've got to build our natural resources. And we do this by providing a healthy and vigorous sod on these pastures. So we keep our soil in place, and over time we actually can enhance that soil through good grazing management. And lastly, a sustainable forage livestock system is going to be profitable. So it doesn't mean we're going to make the same amount of money we would have made if we would have invested in Microsoft at the start, but we certainly want to see a net return to the farm from a livestock system. And that's important. Profitability is important and often left out when we talk about forage management. And I hedge this a little bit with lifestyle goals. Some people have worked their whole life and then they decide that they want to get into agriculture. And it may be for them profitability is not at the very top of their list, but it should be close. Even if it's kind of a hobby for you, you certainly want to make sure that that you're making a little bit of money with your hobby, because that makes your hobby a lot better. I wanted to just talk a little bit about what a soil is, and this is a definition from really a classical soils test, Brady and Weil. This is what most people have if they take soils at the university. And it's a dynamic natural body composed of mineral and organic solids and gases and liquids. And really what I want to focus on today is this living organisms. We don't talk enough about this. We often think of soil as just something that's mineral, something that's static and not living. In a healthy pasture soil, we have a tremendous amount of life in that soil. And that's kind of what I want to talk a little bit about today. the first thing I wanted to mention was soil organic matter, and we always classify organic matter as kind of one big group, but really we can break it into three types of organic matter that we have in our soils. We have what we have called biomass, that's living things in the soil, things like plant roots, things like insects, earthworms, soil microorganisms are all living in the soil. And then we have detritus, and that's things that have died but haven't quite broken down yet, so we can still tell what they are. Plant residue would be a good example of that. And then we have what we call humus, and that's things that have been highly degraded. So organic matter or organisms or plants that have been broken down, and you can't tell what they are anymore, but they've been linked together by microbes within the soil. And those are the three types of soil organic matter that we have. And soil organic matter plays some important roles in the soil. And it reduces the bulk density of the soil. What the bulk density is we take a given unit of soil, like a cubic foot of soil, and we weigh it, and that's what we call the bulk density. When we add organic matter to that soil, the bulk density decreases. It's kind of like giving that soil a little bit of spongy material in that soil. And that's good because that's going to do things like improve soil structure. It's going to improve the chemistry of the soil. It's going to improve water infiltration into that soil, which is really, really important for us because we want water to infiltrate into our soils and not leave our farm because they run off because our soils are compacted. And the other important role that we're going to talk about today of organic matter is that it provides a food source for all those organisms that live in the soil. And we always think about feeding the organism above the soil surface, and that's our livestock, but we also need to think about how do we feed those organisms that are below the soil surface. And organic matter is the food for what I call the citizens of the soil community. And there's lots of different things that make up this group of citizens in the soil community. There's plant roots, and there's earthworms, and nematodes, and insects, and beetles, and ants, and termites, and bacteria, and protozoa, and fungus, and they're all part of this group of what I call the citizens of the soil community. And they all play an important role in building and maintaining strong nutrient cycling within pastures. We're going to talk about some of these in more detail. They do a number of different services for us in the soil. They fix nitrogen, very, very important for us. We want to bring nitrogen into our grassland ecosystems or our pasture or grazing systems. And they do that through dinitrogen fixation with legumes, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. They cycle nutrients, they break plant material down, they decompose it, and then there's actually a whole prey and predator relationship within this soil community. So something can break nutrients down and ingest that plant material, but those nutrients are immobilized within that organism, and then something else comes along and eats it, and all of a sudden those nutrients are released back into the system for plants to use. We have soil structure and aeration. Is a very important role of these organisms in the soil. They increase water infiltration, so we harvest more water and we lose less water to run off on our farm. And they increase water holding capacity in the soil. So if we increase our soil organic matter from 2% to 6%, which can happen in pastures with good grazing management, we're not only going to get more water to infiltrate into that soil, but we'll be able to hold more water in that soil for plant growth. And all these things feed into this soil food web. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but essentially we harvest solar energy from the sun in our grass, and then that grass grows and it breaks down or it's eaten by an animal, and then those nutrients are recycled onto that pasture. And all these organisms in this soil food web help cycle that nutrients through the system. And if you're interested in this is available on the internet, and I've got a link at the end of this that you can go to, but we also have some of these little books here. They're called the Soil Biology Primer, and they're actually excellent books. And if you're interested in one of those, Margaret has those in her office. And they've got a lot of the pictures and a lot of descriptions of these different parts of this soil ecosystem. This is one of my favorite tables. Ed Rayburn put this together, and this shows the biomass of organisms above the ground and below the ground in the pasture ecosystem. And if we look above the ground, if we look at a beef cow, 1,200-pound beef cow, per acre we've got 450 pounds of animal. And if we look at the pasture biomass, at any one given time in a pasture, if it's around 10 inches tall, we've got about 2,500 pounds of dry matter in that, on top of that soil in the form of plants in that pasture. So, and then we look below the ground, and we've got about the same amount in plant roots. And then we get into this bacteria and actinomycetes, and these are closely related, and we can kind of group them together, but if you'll notice there, we've got about 2 tons of bacteria per acre. So think about that just for a minute. These microscopic cells, and we've got 2 tons of those per acre in a healthy pasture. I mean, it's just phenomenal. In 3 tons of fungus per acre growing underneath the soil. And then we've got all these other things, nematodes and protozoa, and we've got 600 pounds of earthworms. 600 pounds of earthworms per acre. I mean, it's really mind-boggling. And when we add all these things up, you know, we've got like 7 tons of living organisms below the soil surface per acre in a healthy pasture. 7 tons. And we've thought about these soils just from being a mineral perspective, but really a healthy pasture soil is full of life. And that's kind of one of the points that I wanted to drive home today. And what we do to the top of the soil and how we manage that pasture impacts the soil life below the soil. And we'll talk more about that. And I want to just take a few minutes and talk about some of the different citizens of the soil community. And the first one is earthworms. And remember, we've got more than 600 pounds of earthworms per acre in a healthy pasture. And there's kind of 3 niches or 3 distinct areas where these earthworms live, or 3 types of earthworms. We have ones that live in the litter right at the soil surface, and they break down plant material. We've got ones that kind of go down a little bit in the soil but kind of move side to side, and they create tunnels underneath the soil, but they don't go very deep into the soil. They're up in the upper top 6 inches. And then we have ones that really burrow down deeply in the pasture, and they can go down several meters in that pasture. And they're really important because they take plant material at the top of the soil, and they actually move that plant material down back into the soil profile. And they cycle those nutrients by ingesting that plant material and then depositing those casts at the soil surface or even down into the soil. And this is kind of an interesting picture. This is from my friend Ed Rayburn, and this was an area, a shade area he had in his pasture. And all these little mounds in here are earthworm burrows. So you can tell he's got a tremendous amount of earthworms in your pastures. And I'd challenge you guys, I bet a lot of you guys have earthworms in your pastures too, and other organisms. You know, we often look at our pastures kind of from the truck, but get out and walk around, and don't be afraid to bend down and dig through your pasture sward a little bit and take a look at what's actually there. And you'll find a tremendous amount of life in those pastures. So think about all those the amount of earthworms it took to make all those burrows in this very small area right here. And it's really astounding at how many are in a pasture. So some of the services they provide, they consume manure and recycle that manure. They speed up decomposition of plant residue because they're eating that residue and then breaking it up into smaller pieces that other soil organisms can break down. They got the value of those worm casts. That's that worm manure, I guess you could call it. They increase the structure and water infiltration and aeration of the soil. They're making tunnels down through that soil. I want to talk just a little bit about soil bacteria. And these are pictures through microscopes. This is through an electron microscope of some different soil bacteria. And this is through a light microscope. But we've got more than a ton of bacteria, and if you group actinomycetes with this, we've got about 2 tons of bacteria per acre. So think about that, these microscopic things, and there's 2 tons of those per acre. And they have a couple of different roles. One is they decompose nutrients, or plant material, and they immobilize those nutrients within their structure. So they actually take those nutrients and they're holding it within that cellular structure of that bacteria cell. And they make energy and nutrients more available in the soil. And we have things that are mutualistic partners with plants, and a good example of that is a symbiotic relationship formed with legume plants. Rhizobium bacteria actually infect the root of a legume plant, form a nodule on that root, and that relationship with that legume plant is that those bacteria fix nitrogen from the air. The air we're breathing, 78% nitrogen. They take that nitrogen, which is not available to the plant, and they turn it into a plant-available form, share it with that legume plant. Clover, alfalfa, Sericea lespedeza are all legume plants. And then in return, that bacteria gets a sugar source from that plant. So it's a relationship where both things get something in. And that's very important in grassland ecosystems because it brings nitrogen into the system. And then we've got soil bacteria, which can cause diseases in plants. And then we have another group, it's a lesser group called chemoautotrophs. And essentially it's using something other than carbon sources for an energy source. It can use iron or sulfur or hydrogen for an energy source. Some of the services they provide is nutrient cycling. They decompose and immobilize nutrients within their structure of the bacteria. And then disease suppression in some cases. They can increase water movement in the soil. They can actually cause the soil to form better aggregates. So the soil particles kind of stick together and form clumps. And when that happens, you have better soil structure. It's easier for water to move into that soil and easier for air to move into that soil, which is an important part of the whole soil structure. And then nitrifying bacteria. So bacteria that convert things like ammonium to nitrate, which plants readily uptake. And then we have a second group of bacteria. It's called actinomycetes, and they actually decompose cellulose and chitin. And chitin is what's in the physical structure of an insect. And there's lots of insects in the soil too, so that's that outer shell of an insect. These bacteria can actually decompose that and make those nutrients available within the soil. So just a little bit more about legumes, and we talked about how they fix nitrogen from the air. So this N2 gas in the air is not available to the plant, but by forming this symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria, and these nodules are full of rhizobium bacteria. If you ever dig up a root of a legume plant and you take one of those nodules and you just cut it open with your knife or pick it open with your fingernail, if it's nice and pink inside, that means it's actively fixing nitrogen from the air. They increase yields, and of course adding legumes like clover to your stand is going to increase forage quality and subsequently animal performance. And they can also improve summer growth. If you choose a deep-rooted legume like a red clover or an alfalfa or Sericea lespedeza that's got a deep taproot, you're going to be able to find more water in the soil during the summer months than you would with the grass plant whose roots are all in that upper 8 to 10 inches of soil. And of course, for us, a very important part of legumes in our whole grassland ecosystem is dilution of the endophyte in tall fescue. So if we have clover in our pastures, it doesn't completely alleviate the endophyte problem in tall fescue, but it helps to dilute the toxins that are formed with that association of that endophyte and that tall fescue plant. So this is just a table of how much nitrogen can be fixed in a clover, and it all depends on the year. But if we take something like ladino clover or red clover, we're going to fix between 75 and 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. And we often make like it's putting nitrogen fertilizer on your pasture, but it's not quite like that. The nitrogen that's fixed by the clover, very little of it's directly shared with the grass plant. And this is where this whole nutrient cycling comes into play. It's very important that we have animals within this system because they help to share that nitrogen. If we look at the value of this nitrogen, depending on our cost, if nitrogen cost was 50 cents, we're looking somewhere around $60 to $100 in in actual value of that nitrogen per acre per year from that having that legume plant into our grazing system. And that's just for the nitrogen. There's other benefits of the legumes that we talked about. One point that I want to drive home is that it's not like putting nitrogen fertilizer in your pasture. Nitrogen is really shared indirectly between a legume plant and a grass plant and a pasture. And the way it's shared is that the animals eat that legume plant, and then it goes through their digestive system, and it comes out in the form of urine and dung on that pasture. And then that urine and that dung is broken down by all these microbes that we've been talking about within that pasture. It's also shared through death and decomposition of plant parts, so shoots, roots of that plant, nodules, they all break down as they die in the soil, and those microorganisms we've been talking about break those plant parts down and release that nitrogen into the system so that the plant can use it again. So most of the sharing goes on indirectly. And it takes a while to build this nutrient cycle up within a pasture. So it's not like you put legumes out one day and all of a sudden you've got this healthy nutrient cycle. It's going to take a couple years for that nutrient cycle to really develop. And how you manage your pastures can impact this. If you've got a good rotational stocking system, then you're going to help develop that nutrient cycle much faster than you would in a continuous stocking system. So things to think about is when we want to really manage for legumes, ideally we'd want legumes to make up about a quarter of the stand. And that'll look like, when it makes up a quarter of the dry matter in that pasture, it's going to look like you've got a lot of legumes in those pastures. We want to fertilize in lime according to soil test. And I know I've said this many, many times before, but don't guess. I mean, soil tests in Virginia are free. And what we want to do in that pasture is create an environment in which those legumes are going to thrive. And sometimes if we just change our management within that pasture, legumes will come into that pasture. Sometimes we don't have that seed bank there. If we don't have that seed bank there, then a lot of times we need to overseed our pastures with a little bit of clover. And this is 4 to 6 pounds of red and 1 to 2 pounds of white clover. And if you can find it, a little bit of annual Lespedeza, it doesn't hurt anything to throw in there. And that costs about $25 per acre. Remember, we're probably getting a value back for $60 per acre. And this $60 will be over a multiple year period. Will add up over multiple years. So it's really a good investment if you don't have clover to overseed your pastures. And if you're interested in doing that, we've got a publication on how to get that done. And there's certain things to think about when you're getting ready to do that so you'll have success with your overseeding process. And then a lot of people notice when they switch their grazing management that they actually encourage different plants to be dominant within their pasture. And grazing management's a powerful, powerful tool. How we manage that grass stand can impact what is dominant in that forage mixture. So say we had a mixture of tall fescue and white clover, and our white clover was starting to become the dominant part of our mixture. Just by changing our grazing management, we could help that grass compete more competitively within that stand. And that's beyond the scope of how you do that's beyond the scope of today's lecture. But if you're interested in that, I've got a presentation on our website that talks about forage plant growth and grazing management and how we can shift the botanical composition of pastures just by how we manage that grazing within that pasture. Protozoa, we kind of always think of the amoeba or protozoa. It's kind of a glob, and they play an important role in nutrient cycling. Remember, we talked about bacteria breaking down plant residue, and the protozoa, what they do is they feed on the bacteria. And when they feed on that bacteria, those nutrients that were immobilized in that bacteria are all of a sudden released for the plant to use. So they play an important part in releasing the nutrients from bacteria in the soil. Fungi is an important part of the soil. Remember, we had about 3 tons of fungi per acre in a healthy pasture stand. Pretty amazing, 3 tons of fungus per acre in a healthy pasture stand. And they decompose organic matter, and they form an important compound. It's kind of like a glue. It's called glomalin, and that actually secretes, makes soil particles stick together. and form aggregates in the soil and improve soil structure. And they extract nutrients, they hold nutrients and prevent loss, and some will even kill nematodes. In this picture, there's a nematode. We'll talk about nematodes in a minute. We always think of nematodes as being bad, but some of them are actually good. And this is actually taken through an electron microscope, and this is a fungi which has made a lasso and is actually killing this nematode in this picture. And this is actually some fungi that grow in the soil, and one of the things that fungi do is they actually increase the root area of the plant, kind of indirectly. They will actually go into the root cells of the plant, infect them, this special type of fungi in the soil called Vesicular, Arbuscular, Mycorrhizae. They go in and they form a kind of mutualistic relationship with that plant root. So they infect it, and then they increase movement of phosphorus and water and other nutrients into that plant root. And there's some evidence that they also can transfer nitrogen directly from legumes to grasses, although that's pretty limited. So this is a fungi that we find often in forests. It's an ectomycorrhizae, and it's very, very important in forests. If you've ever soil tested a forest soil, it's very, very low in phosphorus, and but trees still grow, and they form this mutualistic relationship with this bacteria, and it allows those trees to get enough phosphorus even from those very low phosphorus soils. Talk a little bit about insects and relatives of insects. And this was actually taken, this was a soil sample, and they actually washed all the insects and insect-like fauna out of the soil sample, and this was what's left. So there's a tremendous amount of insects within the soil also. And they include everything from things that are microscopic insects, and these black and white pictures are taken through an electron microscope, and these are springtail, and up to macro-sized things like centipedes and ants and beetles and so forth. And there's a ton of different insects in the soil, and they all play a role in this predator-prey relationship and in breaking down plant tissue and making it more susceptible to further digestion by fungi and bacteria in that soil. And this is just a little dung beetle humor, but this is professions in high demands, and it's got welder and computer programmers, and then it's got dung beetles up there. So when you think, well, this is one of the easiest things to see on your farm, if you've got a healthy pasture ecosystem, go out, when it warms up a little bit and start to look at some of your manure pads. Get a stick and just kind of peel the top of that manure pad off. And if you've got a healthy dung beetle population, you'll see all these beetles running around in that manure pad. And they're actually providing a service to you because they're digesting that dung in that pad, and they're moving it into the soil. If you have a really healthy dung beetle population, a lot of times there'll still be kind of a manure pad there, but it'll kind of be like a shell of a manure pad, and a lot of those nutrients have been moved out into the soil. And they're an important part of this whole nutrient cycling. We have three niches of dung beetles, or three types. One is what we call the tunnelers. This is our most popular one in Virginia. And they actually take manure and they form a little ball, and they take that ball down into the soil. And then they lay an egg in that ball, and they call those brood balls. And then as that dung beetle larvae starts to develop, it actually uses that dung ball as a nutrient source. And then we have what we call our dwellers. And our dwellers kind of live in that manure pad or right at that soil surface. They don't go very deep. And then we have our less popular one. These are more popular in Africa, are rollers. And if you look on YouTube, you can see some videos of those. But they actually make a ball of dung and roll it away from the manure pad and then bury it close to the soil surface. So some of the service they provide is nutrient cycling within grazing systems. There's some evidence they reduce pests and parasites by taking that manure source away where those pests and parasites would develop. Reduce volatilization of manure because they're incorporating it into the soil surface. They bring food to soil microbes. And when they make this brood ball and they take it down into the soil and lay their egg in it, not all of that all those nutrients are used by that developing larvae. About only half of those are used. So that leaves half those nutrients that can be used by other microbes in the soil, and they can break it down. And they improve soil structure. This is the monetary value, and there's a pretty big discrepancy here. I don't know which one's right. This is a paper that was done in 2006 that said that in the United States, dung beetles are worth $380 million a year, which is a pretty big number. And this was another study at the University of Texas, and of course everything's bigger in Texas. And they had a value of $2 billion. I don't know exactly how they came up with that. But even so, the point I want to make is that these organisms are really important in pastures, and they have a real monetary value in terms of nutrient cycling within grazing systems. And just a little more dung beetle humor. This is a dung beetle drive-through, and what do you think a dung beetle gets when it goes through the drive-through? Number 2, of course. All right. Interestingly enough, they just sent out a link to the extension agents that talked about slugs in no-till corn production. And so here we are, we're viewing slugs as a pest, and they certainly can be a pest in no-till production. There's no question about that. But they also serve an important role in pasture ecosystems because they break things down. They shred plant material and break it down, and they prey on other things within pastures to release nutrients. In this first initial processing by things like slugs of vegetative material near the soil surface is important because it breaks it down into smaller pieces that these other organisms can work on and break down further. So slugs and snails are not always pests, but sometimes can be beneficial fauna within grazing systems. Nematodes, we've got a great researcher here at the station, Chuck Johnson, and Chuck works with nematodes. And before I got into this, really looking at nematodes more closely, the only ones I ever heard about was these negative ones, these root feeders that causes damage in crops like soybeans and tobacco. But there's other nematodes that are actually beneficial within pasture ecosystems. There's ones that feed on bacteria. And remember, bacteria mobilize those nutrients within their structure, and that actually releases those nutrients when the nematodes feed on it. Ones that feed on fungus or fungi, and ones that feed on other nematodes, and then ones that feed on a bunch of different things, omnivores. So maybe they feed on each other, maybe they feed on fungi or bacteria. But it's amazing at the diversity within this soil ecosystem. Talk a little bit about nutrient cycling. So we start with the sun. And we capture that sun in the photosynthetic process from plants. And then that plant is eaten by an herbivore. In our case, it would be cattle or sheep or goats or whatever you have, maybe even a horse. And that manure and urine is excreted onto that pasture. And then we have what we call the shredders that reduce particle size. So things like the snail and other insects would reduce the particle size of that manure in any vegetative material that's on top of that soil surface. And then we have bacteria which readily consume degradable carbohydrates. So things that are high in carbohydrates, the bacteria will break down and immobilize those nutrients in their structure. And then we have fungi and actinomycetes, and they break down things that are less degradable carbohydrates, so things like cellulose or lignin or chitin in the insect structure, exoskeleton. So things that are less degradable, the fungi tend to work on. And these macro and micronutrients are released back into the system for plants, and then plants start to grow again. So you can kind of see how this is a whole cycle, and then the animals start to graze the plants again. This doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to build this cycle up in a healthy grazing system. So let's talk a little bit about managing for nutrient cycles in grassland ecosystems. And this is often overlooked. And Taylor and I talk about this, but really for this everything to work the way it should, we've got to have a base level of soil fertility in pastures. And that includes your pH of your soil, so the acidity of your soil, and also your nutrient levels within the soil. And what I want to point out with this diagram is that everything functions the best, all these soil microbes in this nutrient cycling, when we're between 6 and 7 with a pH. And one of the reasons it functions the best is that that's when most of our nutrients are at their maximum availability. So just changing your pH of the soil is going to change the nutrient availability of the soil. And that's why I always tell people, if you've got limited money to spend, your best investment is going to be in lime, because you not only change the pH of your soil, but you're changing the availability of the different nutrients within the soil, and that's really important. So in a grassland ecosystem, we've got inputs coming in the form of any fertilizer we put on, any manure coming onto the site from, say, another area, or even manure that's being recycled within that site. We've got legumes like clover and alfalfa bringing nitrogen into that system. And any kind of anything we feed within that pasture, so it could be hay, it could be concentrate feed or creep feed. Those are all bringing nutrients into that system. And then those nutrients are cycled around through the animal, through all these microbes in the soil, and we create a nutrient cycle within that pasture. An important thing to remember, and one of the most beautiful things about grassland ecosystems, is that most of those nutrients are recycled within that grazing system. 80 to 90% of those nutrients go in one end of the animal and back out the other, and they're cycled around through this system. And then our export in the cow-calf system would be calves primarily. And John Laurie at the University of Missouri did a study where he looked at nutrient removal from a cow-calf pair. And what he found was that a cow-calf pair in a year removed a total of 10 pounds of nitrogen, 7 pounds of P2O5, and a pound of potash. Very, very little nutrients removed by a cow-calf pair in a year. And this is important. This makes a grassland ecosystem really sustainable if it's well managed. And that's one of the points that I want to drive home today. Once you build your nutrient levels up in the soil, we got to monitor, and we'll lose some nutrients to leaching and other losses. But once we build our P and K up and we get our pH right, these systems become really sustainable because we're removing very little nutrients. What we're doing is we're cycling those nutrients around within that system. And I always like to talk a little bit about the impact that grazing has on nutrient distribution within pastures. So even though we're removing few nutrients, what can happen over time is animals can go out in a big pasture boundary and they can graze out here, and then they always come back to the shade and the water sources, right? And they kind of lay down there and they ruminate, and next thing you know, they're getting up to go back out. And what happens when a cow gets up after she's been laying down a while? Well, you all know, she deposits nutrients. And over time, what can happen is that nutrients from here can be moved to here. And so it's interesting when you look at a grid-sampled pasture, you can tell where people have fed hay, you can tell where the shade and the water sources are, because you tend to get nutrient concentrations there. So as managers, what we need to do is do everything we can to get a better distribution of nutrients within the grazing system. And that's one thing that subdividing pastures and rotational stocking does. What happens is that if you keep the animals here and make them graze within this little paddock here, we get a much more even distribution of dung and urine within this pasture, and they're not moving nutrients from here to your shade and water sources. And that's the ideal situation. It's not perfect, but it's better than letting them concentrate nutrients in those shade and water sources. So one of the things that rotational stocking does is gives us a more even distribution of nutrients within grazing systems. And this is important for this whole nutrient cycle and pasture productivity in the long run. This was a study that was done at the University of Missouri, and I kind of feel bad for the graduate student that had to do it, because they actually had to count manure piles. And what they found was that when we had a 3-paddock rotation system, the distribution were concentrated in areas. And when we had a 24-paddock rotation system, the amount of dung piles were much more uniform within a given area, and much heavier within a given area. So one of the benefits, if you've ever looked at a pasture that's rotationally stocked, is you have a better distribution of dung within those pasture areas. One thing that I always like to mention is that if you're making hay, you're removing nutrients from that pasture. And sometimes we don't realize how many nutrients that is. But something like orchard grass is going to remove about 50 pounds of nitrogen, about 15 to 17 pounds of phosphate, and about 60 pounds of potash. So say you had a good year and you removed 3 tons of hay per acre. Good rainfall and everything kind of clicked together. So all of a sudden from that acre you removed 150 pounds of nitrogen, 45 pounds of phosphate, and 180 pounds of potash. I can tell you when somebody shows me a soil sample, I can almost always tell you if it's a hay field, because guess what? The potash is low. And because we generally don't put enough potash back on to meet that nutrient removal. If we want hay fields to remain productive, we've got to replace what we remove from those hay fields. That's really, really important. And a lot of times I hear people say, well, my neighbor's given me this area and I can make hay off of it. You know, generally what happens is if it's not ours, then we don't treat it quite as well as we should, and sometimes we don't put the removal on, the nutrient removal on that we took away, and over time the productivity of that land decreases. And it's important, if we want to maintain productivity, that we replace nutrients that we're removing in that hay. So when we look at the value of nutrients in hay, and I made some assumptions on how many nutrients we're removing, and they're here, and how much the nutrients cost, and you can adjust this for whatever the current price is. But the bottom line is that 1 ton of hay is going to remove about somewhere in that range of $60 to $70 of nutrients per ton of hay. $60 to $70. Let me just ask you, what can you buy a bale of hay for? $20? 25 right now. Yeah, $20 or $25 a bale. So do the math on that. So say that bale weighs maybe 600-700 pounds, somewhere in that range. And it takes 3 of those bales to make a ton. So all of a sudden you're paying somewhere between $60 and $75 for a ton of hay. You know, whoever's selling that hay, they're barely covering their nutrient removal cost. So is that bad for you or good for you? Well, if you're buying the hay, it's probably pretty good, because you're not only getting the feed value of that hay, but you're also bringing those nutrients into your grazing system. And over time, you can build fertility in your pastures by importing nutrients in hay. So just a little bit about hay feeding and nutrient distribution. You can move nutrients around your farm. So say you're on an old dairy, and where would your nutrients be concentrated in an old dairy? Yeah, close to the barn, because when we haul manure, we generally like to haul at the least distance that we possibly have to, right? So generally the fields surrounding the milking platform is going to have higher concentrations of nutrients. So if that's the case and we're high in phosphorus in those areas, a lot of times we could produce hay there and then feed that hay on pastures that are further from the barn, and over time move nutrients from one pasture to another, just by where we feed that hay at. If we're making hay in a field, in the ideal situation is that we want to keep the fertility of that field up where we're making hay. If we could feed that hay back in that field, that would be the ideal situation. Feed hay on your porous pastures, and then move your feeding points around. And there's lots of different ways, and some people like to unroll hay, some people like to use bale wagons, some people use rings, but what we should do is try to move those feeding points around if we can. And that's sometimes easier said than done, especially when it's so wet and sloppy out like it is now. But if we can move those feeding points around within that pasture, what will happen over time is we'll get a more even nutrient distribution within the pasture. If we always feed our hay right beside the gate, which a lot of us do, you know, we'll get a nutrient concentration right beside that gate. Let's talk just a little bit about healthy soil ecology. And one of the things that we need to do to really keep our microbes and things below the ground healthy is to provide a food supply for those. It's not unlike our livestock. We're just feeding a different group of organisms that are working for us in our pastures. And we do that by maintaining some residue on our pastures. And this goes back to this whole idea of rotational stocking and maintaining some plant residue. And this organic matter, this organic residue on top of the soil surface and the roots below the soil surface are feeding this microbial community within the pasture. And this is, I'm not asking you to change your management. I'm just asking you to think a little bit about what you're doing. And when you impose good grazing management, indirectly, you're helping to increase the health of your soils on your farm by providing a feed source for those organisms that are working in the soil. You have to provide habitat for those organisms. And again, this goes back to good grazing management. We're keeping some residue on the soil surface. We're having a good residual height when we graze our pastures, and that's helping to shade that soil and modify that soil temperature within that pasture. If we've got some residual leaf area, we're shading the soil, we're reducing moisture loss from that soil during the summer months, and we're modifying that soil temperature, so we're moderating it so it's not quite as hot as it would be if that was bare ground in that pasture. We want to maintain a healthy diversity of consumers and predators and prey and so forth within that soil community. And then create a chemical environment that enhances that soil community. We talked about that. Good soil fertility management, good pH, adequate levels of nutrients, but not excessive levels of nutrients within that pasture. And then we talked about modifying that microclimate at the soil surface to help enhance the soil microbial community. So we want to keep our soil pH between 6 and 7 ideally. We want adequate but not excessive rates of phosphorus and potassium within our soil system. And don't guess at it. Soil tests are free in Virginia. Take a soil test and then you can really have a targeted soil application. You're not just applying 10, 10, 10 or 19, 19, 19. You're putting on what the soil needs and not over applying nutrients, which costs you money. You want to manage nutrient flows on the farm, so that goes back to this whole building a stronger nutrient cycle. You recycle manure and urine and organic residues and how you feed the hay, all manage the nutrient flows on that farm. And then have proper grazing management. So rest and residual height after we graze a pasture is really important in building that habitat and providing that food source for those things that live below the soil surface. So don't graze too close or too frequently in pasture. Sometimes it happens and we can't avoid it, but ideally we want to manage our residual height within that pasture, and we want to make sure we give those pastures adequate rest periods. And those rest periods will vary. They can be pretty short in the spring, and they probably need to be longer in the summer as those plants' growth slows down. And we want to create habitat within those pastures for those soil microorganisms. We want to incorporate legumes. Interestingly enough, cattle tend to like legumes in grazing systems, but earthworms do too. If they had a choice between a grass plant and a legume plant, they'll tend to eat the legume plant in that pasture rather than the grass plant. When we're worming our animals, if we can use a dung beetle friendly wormer, that would be ideal, and moxidectin is one of those dung beetle friendly wormers. We're always going to have weeds in pastures, and we really need to approach those weeds with kind of a balanced approach, an integrated management approach. So generally where we get a weed at in a pasture is where there's a hole in that sod, and the good Lord puts a Band-Aid on that hole, and usually that's a weed. And some weeds are okay, and some weeds are not good to have. And we have to kind of manage our soil and our pasture stand and our animals all together to kind of control weeds within pastures. And we have to live with a few weeds. It's not economical to try to control every weed that you have in the pasture. And at times we'll have to use herbicides, and we've got some great pasture herbicides out there. Forefront is one of those herbicides. The downside to using a herbicide in a pasture is that anything that's not a grass you're going to kill or damage. And that can hurt your whole pasture ecosystem in the long run. So I know at some point when you get a lot of horse nettle in a pasture, you just got to bite the bullet and then reintroduce legumes into your pastures or let them redevelop over time. And so minimal use of herbicides when you really need them, but that shouldn't be your first. That shouldn't be your first choice. If you've got bad weed problems, then maybe you need to step back and look a little bit at your management and say, well, why do I have these weed problems? And Something like horse nettle, sometimes you just have those problems. But other weeds, maybe it's related to your management. Maybe you have lower soil fertility than optimal. Maybe your grazing management's not as good as it should be, and that allows those weeds to compete actively with the desired pasture plants. So one of the take-home messages that I want to leave you with today is that we're managing much more than just livestock when we think about grassland ecosystems or pasture systems. We're managing all these things that are not only above the soil but below the soil too. And good grazing management is going to enhance not just pasture productivity and livestock productivity, but also the productivity of the soil community below the soil surface. And probably the most important part of a grassland ecosystem is not the bacteria or not the legumes or not the livestock. It's you as a manager. You're the ones that kind of hold this whole system together. You're making the decisions on how those animals graze that pasture. And in that role, you're the most important thing holding the whole thing together. In this bottom picture is actually from a grazing school that we had this fall at the research station. And that was a great grazing school. We had about 30 people in it. We'll probably have another one this spring sometime. And if you haven't gone to one of these, it's worth your time. It's about a 2-day course, full 2 days, and in a small group, not more than 30 people, and that allows you to ask questions and have interactions. And it's not only in the classroom, but it's hands-on. We spend half the day inside and half the day outside, and we've got some exercises that we do out in the pastures that are really beneficial, especially if you're just getting started in grazing or want to learn more about grazing. And these are some of the resources I used to put this presentation together. If you want to learn more about the microbes that live in the soil or soil health, you can take a look at these publications. And this one in the middle is really a good one, and it's actually available online. If you're interested, that's the website that you can go to pick that up. And if you don't get it now, I'll be happy to send you a link to the website. It's not in a form. It's not in a PDF form that you can just print this book out. It's in a web page form. But if you don't want to spend the money on the book, you can go there and just read it and look at the pictures there. Is there any questions? I know that was a lot. Probably more than most of you wanted, but I hope you have a better appreciation for what's going on underneath that soil now. Is there any questions? And it doesn't have to be on this topic. It's open season on the forage specialist. You got any other questions about anything? Go ahead.
What's being done about thistles?
Thistles? What kind of? There's several different kinds of thistles. There's ones that that are perennials and regenerate with roots underground. And those are more difficult to control, but we can control those with some of the new pasture herbicides. The bad part about controlling them with new pasture herbicides are that you kill everything else that's a broadleaf within that pasture. But sometimes you've got to make that sacrifice. The other thistles that are common problems are biennials, and biennials are very easily controlled in the spring with just a little bit of 2,4-D. And 2,4-D will ding your clover up at a light rate, but usually it doesn't kill the clover in the pasture. So if you have a biennial thistle that's a problem, then you can control it pretty easily and not kill all the clover in your pastures.
Well, a few years ago, there was some work being done on insects to control the things. Any results of that?
I don't know anything about the insect control for thistles.
It was just hopeful.
Yeah. Usually when we do one thing, we mess something else up within the system. So, go ahead. The what? Vinegar, yeah. I've seen that before, that people talk about vinegar killing the thistles. I'm not sure if that's economical on a large basis. But I remember when I interviewed here at the research station, we went to Burton Allen's farm. And Burton Allen, in his truck, carried a little thing to grub thistles out of his pasture with everywhere he went. Whenever he saw a thistle, he'd grub it out in a little spray bottle of Roundup with him. So that selective weed control seemed to work for him in his pastures. I'm good to go. I'm done, Lindy. I finished early. Is there any other questions?
Red
So the question was, is the benefits of dragging manure in your pastures. And I've never seen any research that says that it's economically beneficial. I think if you have a healthy dung beetle population in your pastures, it really goes a long way at breaking those manure pats down. And I'm not sure what the effect of dragging would have. Usually when we drag it, the manure piles are already dried up. But I've never seen a positive economic benefit in any kind of replicated research.
Would altitude affect the dung beetle population?
Would what?
The insect growth and the fly stop minerals.
So the question was about fly stop minerals and whether it negatively impacts dung beetle populations. The answer is I don't know. So maybe our entomologists could answer that question better. But I suspect if it's killing other insects, unless it's a friendly to the dung beetles, it may be knocking their populations back too.
Chris, in other turf grass, such as golf courses and recreational fields and so forth, we do porcine aerification. I can see if we have a good insect population, we don't need it, but it's just not economically feasible on your pastures.
So the question is about soil aeration in pastures, and people will do it, and they have the airway aerators and so forth. And I don't know. I think it can be beneficial in some cases. You know, if you have situations where the soil's compacted, maybe by winter grazing, and the soils were a little bit wet when you're on them, then aeration may help. But generally, most of the research done with aeration has not been able to show a consistent positive benefit in pastures. And really, if you can count on having diverse plant species which have root structure that goes down and kind of breaks soil up, you know, like legume roots and other forbs that have kind of a tap root on them. And a good one is like some of the brassicas have a very deep tap root that can break soils up and compaction up, and some of the legumes like alfalfa or Sericea lespedeza that have a deep taproot, and then these organisms like worms that can help break up soil structure and create better soil structure. I think you're better off than trying to introduce something that you've got to buy that piece of iron and then you've got to spend diesel fuel to run it. So, and I'm not saying you never need any tillage within the system, because certainly in some cases you'll need to smooth things out and reseed things for sure. Is there any other questions? Well, it's been a pleasure, and Cynthia, I finished early, so you better get a picture.